With the widespread dissemination of mobile telephones and other wireless devices in the 1990s, there was a rapid increase in both public concern and scientific debate regarding exposure to radio frequency electromagnetic fields emitted from these devices and possible effects on health, especially cancer. I've discussed this at length on the channel before, especially with the advent of the 4G and 5G technologies that seem to have everybody wound up, despite the fact that it's really no different to previous generations. There's also been no evidence presented that mobile phones and their supporting infrastructure are harmful to humans. Zero. Absolutely nothing. However, a comment from a viewer recently asked if I'd cover the alleged link between Tetra Airwave, the UK's emergency service radio system, and cancer. I rather flippantly replied saying that there's no link between the two, but after some thought, I probably shouldn't have been so dismissive, and I apologise. So instead, I thought I'd make a video on this interesting topic. I first stumbled across this claim in the 2003 documentary Something in the Air, a film made by, I think, Channel 4. It discussed the fears in numerous communities, especially in Wales, where Tetra Airwave was first rolled out, and showed angry folk at council meetings objecting to the radio towers being erected. This documentary was on YouTube until around 10 years ago, and I've never been able to find it since, so if anyone has it, I'd love to see it again. Terrestrial trunked radio, or TETRA, is used for radio communications amongst British police forces and other emergency services. Its commercial name is Airwave. The average output power of a TETRA radio can, in some circumstances, exceed that from mobile phones, and as compared with mobile phones, for which transmissions are pulsed at 217 Hz, the TETRA signal has a pulse rate of 17.6 Hz. Therefore, the mechanism of any potential effects on health, including cancers, may differ if any, and we've yet to see any of these effects. A key factor to note is that no RF EMF is emitted by an airwave radio in listening mode, something that many police officers were not aware of. Back in 2000, the UK Independent Expert Group on Mobile Phones, or the Stewart Report, which I covered extensively in my last 5G video, linked below, suggested that as a precautionary measure, signal modulation around 16 Hz should be avoided if possible in future signal coding development, based on experimental findings of increased brain calcium efflux associated with such frequencies in animal models. This refers to experiments conducted in the early 1970s that looked at the effects of modulated VHF fields on the central nervous systems of animals. It's important to note that everything you'll find on a Tetra Airwave tower emits non-ionizing radiation. It does not have enough energy to remove an electron or negative particle from an atom or molecule. While non-ionizing radiation isn't strong enough to directly affect the structure of atoms or damage DNA, it does cause atoms to vibrate, which in turn can cause them to heat up. This is what is often classified as a thermal effect. To experience this, you'd have to be up extremely close to or touching the antennas themselves. Like many other antennas on a radio tower, you could expect an RF burn, and prolonged exposure up close can cause cataracts. Some police officers complained in the early 2000s about skin rashes, nausea, headaches and depression as a consequence of using their airwave handsets. In addition, a small subgroup in the population self-reported being sensitive to electromagnetic fields in general. There were some really truly bizarre stories that appeared in the early 2000s, and when you scratch away the surface or look at who's behind them, you can quickly discount any credibility they may have had. For example, when an airwave mast was switched on in Dursley in Gloucestershire, people there allegedly complained of migraines, sleeplessness, nosebleeds, and being shocked awake up to 15 times a night. When I read into this, it appears to be just a scaremongering exercise by the Mast Action Group. The real story was the fact that the residents in the town were complaining of a loss of or interruption to their television signals. O2 admitted the problem was being caused by the new base station and worked to solve the issue. Suzanne Everdell, who appeared in the Something in the Air documentary back in 2003, was the source of the more embellished version of this story. She installed protective nickel-plated net curtains for protection against the Dursley airwave transmitter. Interestingly, the fact that her children were made to sleep in wooden cages coated in chicken wire was left out of the BBC story, but did appear in the documentary. At a school in Littlehampton, Sussex in 2003, 11 children allegedly had to be sent home on the day a nearby airwave mast went live. The children apparently suffered from dizziness and, like the residents of Dursley, severe headaches and nosebleeds. It was claimed that the local community didn't know the mast had been switched on, so the children's reactions therefore couldn't have been psychosomatic. Again, when we look at the real story, it turns out that an airwave antenna on Littlehampton Police Station, which was also close to 4 local schools, had been causing concern amongst parents. This concern was propagated by the Tetra Watch group that stemmed from an ecologist story in October 2004, and there's no evidence that 11 children were sent home due to illness caused by the airwave mast. At Drumcarrow Hill in Fife, an airwave transmitter which had allegedly been in operation since the late 1990s was thought to be behind at least 7 cases of cancer and 5 cases of motor neurone disease diagnosed in the area over a period of 5 years. This story that surfaced in 2003 is extremely suspicious, as it claims that the transmitter had been running since the late 1990s, despite Airwave being founded in 2000. This story originated from retired nurse Catherine Gamba, who spoke of her concerns to a newspaper in late summer 2003 and actually referred to a transmitter installed by Dolphin Telecommunications, who ran a separate unrelated Tetra network in the late 1990s and early 2000s. The NHS said that it would investigate this alleged health cluster if asked to do so, but they were never asked and nothing else came of the story. In October 2003, Airwave erected a tetramast a quarter of a mile away from the centre of the village of Tayham Lone on the Kintyre Peninsula, and by the middle of December 2003 there were apparently 5 deaths in the village. These included a couple in their late 40s, with the wife dying of a brain hemorrhage and the husband of a heart attack. I found nothing to back up this story, and it appears to be more nonsense relating to the Tetra Watch group and its friends. In 1999, a 5-year-old epileptic child, Nicola Palmer, lived in Milford Haven. At that time, her doctors had got a number of epileptic fits down to 2 a week from a much higher number as a baby. A 2G mobile phone mast was erected on the adjoining fire station, 60 metres away from Nicola's home. Once switched on, the number of fits increased rapidly to 287 a month. When Nicola was moved away from Milford Haven, the number of fits returned to 2 a week. This was another nonsense story that was embellished wildly by Tetra Watch. Looking into this article from June 1999 further, it appears that Nicola had been weaned off medication before the mast was erected, but had up to 6 fits a day after it was switched on. The story doesn't mention any of the other details or embellishments added to the Tetra Watch version of events. It was also reported in the early 2000s that some officers complained of migraines, burning sensations, sleeplessness and a lack of concentration after using airwave radios, while others reported severe deafness, nausea and body warming. Interestingly, most of these stories came from outlets like the Sun newspaper and other tabloid junk publications. I'll address these allegations later on in the video. One case that comes to mind is the death of PC Neil Dring. Now, I have to point out here that my mentioning of this story is in no way meant to demean, mock or poke fun at Neil Dring or his family. Neil died tragically at the age of just 38, 10 months after being diagnosed with cancer of the esophagus. He began complaining of severe headaches shortly after the airwave system was introduced. He complained to his superiors that his handset was making him ill and that he was convinced it caused his cancer. It was alleged at that time that a second officer who was 40 and worked for the same force had also been diagnosed with the same cancer and was being treated. A health and safety advisor for Leicestershire Police said he was 99% certain that PC Dring's death had nothing to do with airwave, and added that the other officer who had contracted cancer was of a senior rank and rarely used airwave. The force met with Neil Dring's family in late 2004, but the story went cold soon after. PC Dring and his family believe that Tetra Airwave was to blame for his death, and I respect their belief and opinion on this. It appears, however, that it was just an awful coincidence, but regardless of the cause of his death, it's still a tragic story. Back in the early 2000s, many of the above stories were exacerbated and manipulated by groups I've just mentioned, such as Tetra Watch. Tetra Watch was set up in around 2004 to encourage people to campaign against Tetra Airwave. They relied heavily on regurgitated information presented by Barry Trower, who has appeared often in Mark Steele collaborations. I'll say no more. Barry is an independent researcher on the harmful effects of radio waves, whose views on the health effects of microwave radiation are controversial and not universally accepted within the scientific community. Mark Steele is a conspiracy nut whose latest campaign is the ludicrous idea that ULEZ cameras are directed energy weapons. Yes, you heard that correctly. TetraWatch produce some interesting material nonetheless. Many of their anecdotes and reports on the health effects of Tetra Airwave appear to come from the Worthing area, which is suspicious in itself, and they didn't appear to present much in the way of updates after 2007. In fact, they felt so strongly about Tetra destroying humanity that the website is now defunct and offline. Masked Sanity was another crazy conspiracy group that was against the rollout of Tetra Airwave, and even had a telephone hotline, which I called, that's now dead. They had a number of protests and demonstrations, but these failed to attract much attention. Their short-lived website saw no new activity after February 2004 and disappeared altogether in the mid-2000s. Again, they clearly must have felt strongly about the issue until the hype died down. They did reappear sometime later, but their new website was less about Airwave and more about phone masts, Wi-Fi, DECT cordless phones, and electrosensitivity. There's been no new activity for over a decade. Mast Action Group, founded in the very early 2000s, was more about mobile phone technology, but did cover Tetra Airwave. They weren't so much against the rollout of these technologies, but what they deemed to be unnecessary and insensitive siting of masts too close to family homes, schools and hospitals. The group seemed to grow into a page to try and get people to file claims of radiation poisoning by television transmitters with solicitors. Absolutely crazy. Nevertheless, it disappeared almost 8 years ago. Tower Action Group was a group of local residents who were concerned about the number of mobile phone masts being placed near to homes, schools and hospitals. They were particularly worried about the Gores Hill Water Tower near to Wallasey on the Wirral, which is less than 200 metres from 2 primary schools. The group was set up in 2003 and there was no activity after 2005. The website disappeared altogether in 2011. There was also a health concerns registry where people could privately submit their health-related issues caused by mobile phones or base stations. You'll note that a lot of these groups seem to stem from mobile phone scaremongering and branch out into Airwave when everyone else jumped on the bandwagon. Of course, the media didn't help in alleviating the issue either by constantly publishing scaremongering articles based on zero scientific evidence. So, to address these concerns, the Home Office commissioned the Airwave Health Monitoring Study to assess possible long-term health effects of Tetra Airwave use amongst the British police. The aim of this part of the video is to present the findings from that study and others of cancer and other health-related risks associated with Tetra use. The Airwave Health Monitoring Study is an occupational cohort launched in June 2004, enrolling police personnel across Great Britain. A total of 53,114 participants were enrolled by the end of recruitment in March 2015. Personal radio usage information was available for 49,286 of those participants. They excluded a further 768 participants with a prior cancer diagnosis from cancer registry data or on questionnaires, leaving 48,518 participants for analysis. The study focused on personal radio use, which is the most commonly used Tetra device in the police service. For participants uniquely linked to a specific personal radio device, they retrieved the call duration for each device from the network so that they could directly measure the operator's average usage. For the rest of the participants, statistical methods were applied to estimate their usage based on self-reported radio use and participant characteristics. In the UK, there's a network of cancer registries which are notified of every cancer diagnosis. For the participants in the study, their information was linked with their consent to the cancer registries, meaning the study was able to obtain information on every cancer diagnosed on study participants. Because the police wear their personal radio device on the upper chest with the aerial in proximity to the head and neck when speaking, they separately considered head and neck cancers based on the National Cancer Intelligence Network definition, with the addition of the eye and surrounding areas, the brain, the spinal cord and cranial nerves. The study used the Cox Proportional Hazards Model to compute hazard ratios or HRs for all cancer and head and neck cancers in relation to estimated monthly personal radio usage in the year before enrolment. Age was used as the underlying timescale, with adjustment for potential confounders of sex, region, education, salary, rank, job satisfaction, body mass index, smoking and number of cigarettes smoked, and alcohol consumption. Amongst personal radio users, they log-squared transformed their usage in minutes per month, so hazard ratios corresponded to a doubling in usage time. They included an interaction term with a binary variable for personal radio user, which gave an estimate for the hazard of being a radio user compared with a non-radio user. They analysed the risk of diagnosis of all cancers combined, as well as head and neck cancers for people with different personal radio usage levels. Overall, no association between average personal radio usage and subsequent risk of cancer was found. People who used the radio devices were no more likely to develop cancer than non-users, and in those participants who did use personal radio devices, the average duration of use did not affect the risk of cancer. A randomized double-blind provocation study was conducted in 2010 to establish whether short-term exposure to Tetra base station signals had an impact on the health and well-being of individuals with self-reported electrosensitivity and of participants who served as controls. A double-blind provocation study is a type of clinical trial in which neither the participants nor the researcher knows which treatment or intervention participants are receiving until the clinical trial is over. 51 individuals with self-reported electrosensitivity and 132 age and sex-matched controls participated in an open provocation test. 48 sensitive and 132 control participants went on to complete double-blind tests in a fully screened semi-anechoic chamber. Heart rate, skin conductance and blood pressure readings provided objective indices of short-term physiological response. Visual analog scales and symptom scales provided subjective indices of well-being. The study found no difference on any measure between Tetra and sham or no signal under double-blind conditions for either controls or electrosensitive participants, and neither group could detect the presence of Tetra signals at rates greater than chance, 50%. When conditions were not double-blind, however, the self-reported electrosensitive individuals did report feeling worse and experienced more symptoms during Tetra compared than with sham or no signal. The study did suggest, however, that the adverse symptoms experienced by electrosensitive individuals were due to the belief of harm from Tetra base stations rather than the low-level EMF exposure itself. In 2002, it was alleged by the Sun newspaper that nearly 200 officers involved in a Tetra Airwave pilot scheme in Lancashire and North Yorkshire had taken time off sick. The officers claimed that the new airwave radios induced migraines, sleeplessness and concentration problems. A study was conducted in 2019 to investigate the association of personal radio use and sickness and absence amongst police officers and staff from the Airwave Health Monitoring Study. Sickness and absence records for 26 forces were linked with personal radio usage for 32,102 participants. The study ultimately found similar or lower risks of sickness and absence overall on comparing users and non-users of personal radios. An association between the amount of radio use amongst users and sickness and absence seemed more likely to have reflected different working patterns amongst police personnel with higher compared to lower radio usage than effects of RF exposure. There have been some explanations given in relation to some of the issues that have been raised over the years. Firstly, Tetra terminals do sometimes get warm, not because of the radio frequencies they emit, but because of the current flowing from the batteries, much like a mobile phone or two-way radio does. Symptoms like nausea, tingling, headaches and sleep disturbances can sometimes appear as part of what is called a psychosomatic condition. These symptoms are very real to people who suffer them, but instead of being produced by the actual risk, they're internally generated by stress due to the perception of that risk by the sufferer. They can be reported, for example, by people who become concerned about something in their environment, about their food, or the possibility of exposure to chemicals. Studies on mobile phones have consistently found that a small proportion of users report these types of symptoms. The trail went cold on all of this hysteria around 2005 and 2006 for the most part, after the main rollout of Tetra was completed. Where did all of these concerned people go? Where did all the websites go? And why did the hysteria die down? Well, it's probably safe to say that the majority of people who reported health issues in relation to the system were suffering from illnesses unrelated, and were naturally scared by the constant peddling of the conspiracy. Many illnesses and alleged deaths were proven to be coincidental, and these stories too just dropped off the radar as the discussion started to fade. And of course, like the 5G conspiracy, which by the way stems from the initial mobile phone rollout 25 years ago, people love to jump on the bandwagon. They report symptoms that are in their head. They support the conspiracies as part of a wider set of beliefs. They usually believe that everyone's out to get them. As pattern-seeking human beings, we tend to look for a reason behind everything. If someone feels that they can blame a harmless radio tower on all of their problems, then it may make them feel better. The stories relating to Tetra Airwave evolved in later years from health scares to simple neighbourhood objections. People didn't want what they deemed to be ugly masts close to their homes, which is understandable. The same goes with 5G. I, on the other hand, welcome them. The network coverage for both mobile phones and airwave has undoubtedly saved more lives than it's harmed. To date, no study has found any evidence that Tetra use is associated with the risk of cancer or any other health effects. I'll link all of the studies mentioned in this video in the description below.